talked about a woman with significant back science. I'm sure we all have sisters and wives. I can particularly testify. And when presidents go anywhere and they make a pledge or they promise something to happen here or do this here, you know who pays it? The chief of staff. So my comrade is launching his book. I can afford to be generous because the chief of staff will pay. So I'll buy the first copy for 200,000.
If you cross, go back.
Hey, why are you going? They told you to.
Comrade Ipoku, the chairperson for this evening's function, His Excellency President John Dramani Mahama, and Comrade, distinguished all of you. Where do we start? Perhaps it is important to start from the very beginning. Early this year, I was in the offices of Pan-African Television, and I had a visitor. That visitor said to me, "Is not Ghanaian." And we had a conversation about reparations. And at the end of the conversation, this visitor said, "Why don't you write your views down?" And I said, "Me to write about reparation? I don't know anything about reparation." And he said, "No, you can do it. From this conversation, I'm sure that you can write about reparation." So I set out to write an essay on reparation, not a book. And I called my comrade Abdul Haq Ibrahim, who normally does the research, and I said, "Dig up the facts, dig up the figures, and so on." In 3 days, my desk was full with data. And by the time I'd gone through it, I'd come to the conclusion that it was an important subject worthy of discussion. Then I started, and Marian will testify that when I started, I normally sleep 4 hours a day. But when I started this work, I was sleeping 2 hours a day. And I got everybody involved, everybody around me. Some were doing proofreading, some were checking for facts and so on. So there's a huge team which was working on this. And I think it would be modest on my part to claim all the credit for this book, because the credit goes to all those who came up with the idea, all those who worked on the idea, all those who did the designing, like Godwin and so on, Victoria who did the typing, everybody who worked on it. This book belongs to all of us, not me. Then when I started writing in 3 days, I called my friend and said, "I've done 60 pages. And he said, "Do you want to stop?" And I said, "There's so many areas which have not been covered." He said, "Carry on." And then I carried on, and eventually ended up with a 130-page book on reparations. Having done 130 pages, I then started cracking my brain about who was going to write the foreword. And I had many friends, many comrades who could write the foreword. But I then came up with the idea of contacting His Excellency the President to write the foreword. And initially I thought it was a crazy idea. I mean, this is the President of the Republic, given all the problems we have, given all the pressures on his shoulder and so on. I thought it was reckless to ask the President to write the foreword to this book. But I tried, and I called him. He doesn't always pick my call. But on this occasion, the President picked my call. And I said, well, I'm doing a book on reparations, and given the fact that you are the AU champion on reparations, would you kindly write the foreword? And his answer was simple. He said, bring the book. Just that, bring the book. So I took the book to the President, and I was wondering, when will he have time to read this? Not the ideas of Nkrumah, not the ideas of Secretary, but the ideas of somebody like me on 130 pages, and you expect the President to find time to read it. 2 weeks later, I get a call from Dr. Prez Mahama, and he says, the foreword is ready. I was in a hurry to get the foreword. I couldn't wait. And when I got the foreword and read it, and it's in the book, so all of you will have the opportunity of reading the foreword. What brilliance! What depth of knowledge and understanding! When I read the foreword by His Excellency President John Dramani Mahama, I felt so proud to be a Ghanaian. I'm so proud to have him as my president. And you will read it for yourself. The scholarship was extraordinary. His depth of understanding was deep. So now I have the foreword. We put the book together and so on. And a friend of mine came up with the idea of taking this book to Malabo, where the AU was having its mid-year review. So I flew to Malabo and attended a conference of the ECOSOC, which is it's not about diplomats, it's not about heads of states and so on. It's about activists like me, like Tutu Poku, like Kita. His Excellency President John Dramani Mahama arrived in town for the heads of states session. And I got a message that he wanted to give copies of the book to his colleague heads of states. I must say that I'm highly honored that the President himself made sure that his colleague heads of states at the meeting got copies of the book. And I thank you very much, Mr. President. Indeed, 2 weeks after the Malabo conference, I came to Accra, and then we started checking our social media platforms, my X page, and all of that. And in 2 weeks, we had 30,000 requests for the book. And I simply could not believe it. Recently, I was invited to Johannesburg in South Africa to attend a meeting of experts, and I mean experts. Everybody in the room had a title except me. There were representatives of the Pan-African Lawyers Union. There were professors in law and so on who were preparing a case actually for the African Court of Human Rights and Justice, or Justice and Human Rights, whatever. And they brought me in there because they thought that I had written this book and therefore I was an expert. How easy to be an expert in this world. But I was there. there and I put on the pretensions of an expert. And after 2 days, we managed to prepare the case for the African court. It was explained to me that the reason why I was there was that the issue of reparation is not just about the law, but it's also about history, it's about our politics, and it's about the intervention of social forces in Africa. And the lawyers thought that my views would be important in that direction. I hope they found my views useful. But having said that, and when the president is around, we don't talk for too long, so I'm about to catch what I'm about to say. I just like to say simply that reparation is not about monetary compensation for the wrongs done to us. Because no amount of money can pay for the evil deeds of the capitalist states and their allies. No amount of money can pay for that. You see, comrades, there was a beautiful African woman. I'm not so sure what language I should use around here. But a very beautiful African woman with a very impressive backside. When the colonialists came and saw this woman, they decided that this woman should be put on exhibition. So they captured her, they took her to Europe, and took her from country to country, exhibiting her like a monkey in the zoo. What amount of money can pay for this? A couple of days ago, I circulated some material on WhatsApp to my friends about another woman from Elmina, Edna, in Ghana, in the central region of Ghana, who had some skin problem. And she decided to apply African herbs and ointments. She was arrested by the colonialists, sent to Europe for trial for sorcery. Now, those of you who are a bit older will remember that in Accra, not too long ago, the rich hospital, which is now the Greater Accra Hospital, was a whites-only hospital. Only whites. Blacks were not allowed in the rich hospital. You understand? I've also come upon material which tells the story of why the slavers, the slave masters and their agents and so on, thought that the best leather bag you could use was one made with black skin. Black human skin. They used it to make leather. The same way you use the hide of cows and so on to make leather. What compensation can pay for this? And the many more. But you see, somehow, all of us, or many of us, have become victims of colonialism without even recognizing that we are victims. We think it's enlightenment because we don't know the history, part of the history. Because they're certainly educated, but they don't know their history, and they are foolish to the extreme. You know why? Because colonialism continues up till today. It has not stopped. What explains our poverty? What explains our underdevelopment? Today, look around all of Africa. Look at our railway lines. Just look at our railway lines. And it tells the story. All of our railway lines start from areas of concentration of wealth. When you have your gold, diamond, magazine, timber, and so on. Where do they end up? All of them end up in the ports. And if that system does not change, colonialism has not come to an end. Today, all over Africa, unfortunately, including the Republic of Ghana, today, we are hosting U.S. military facilities, U.S. forward operating base for the U.S. Army. What is wrong with us? This must change if we are clear agreement. You go to French-speaking Africa, all of them, except recently when the Sahel states came up, they put their foreign reserves in the Central Bank of France. So they borrow their own money from the Central Bank of France and pay interest on their own money that they have borrowed. That is the tragedy. Those of you who travel across borders in Africa, and I do a little bit of traveling. I travel across Ghana-Togo border. And you're on the border, and Lieutenant Colonel Begolate should know he's on the border, he comes from Lepe, and I've walked across the border with him a couple of times, and so on. You go to the house. The bedroom is in Ghana, the bathroom is in Togo. How come? Because when the colonialists were dividing our countries, they didn't care about who was whose cousin, who was whose uncle, and so on. They wanted their spheres of influence so that they could steal our resources. So they didn't care. So we've come up with this absurdity, which we fight over, which we try to defend, and so on. It simply doesn't make sense. But finally, you see, one of the reasons why we are here, immersed in poverty, immersed in these horrible conditions, is simply the fact that we are taking our prescriptions from the people who poisoned us. There's poison in our system. We want to get rid of the poison. But we go to the people who poisoned us in the first place, give us prescriptions. So you go and they tell you that if you are to get out of poverty and underdevelopment, you have to follow the example of Britain. You have to follow the example of France. You have to follow the example of Germany and so on. My brothers and sisters, I stand here and I tell you that if you follow those examples, it will lead you to your doom, and there is no salvation at the end of the road. Why do I say this? Ask yourself how those countries came to be what they are today. All of them, without exception, came to be what they are today because they captured our forebears and made them work for them as beasts of labor, beasts of burden, for hundreds of years without pay. The accumulation which led to the development of the capitalist states came from classical colonialism. That accumulation came from today's neo-colonialism. So if you are to follow the example of Britain, my brother, tell me which country in the world we as Ghanaians today can also go and capture their people as slaves to work for us for hundreds of years without pay. It doesn't make sense. Tell me which country in the world we can also go and colonize. Tell me which country in the world will come and put their foreign reserves in the Bank of Ghana and take loans from us, and then we charge them interest on their own money. It is not possible. The path of capitalist development is not a path which is available to us. And it's important for us to realize that the only path to development available to us is the path of collective self-reliance guided by the principles of socialism as Kwame Nkrumah taught us. There is no alternative to that. As you all know, and this is not new, this is not science, this is not new, Einstein taught us something. Einstein told us that if you do the same thing repeatedly and you expect a different outcome, you are fit for your salary. So if you go to the IMF 18 times and still your economy is in this state and you want to go to the IMF, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Kindly resume your seats. Thank you. Let me proceed on a start. Chichi Opoku and the author of the book, Mr. Kwesi Pratt, and all the distinguished people here who have come to lend your presence to what is the launch of a very important book. Kwesi said a few things, and he said that the issue of reparations is not just about monetary compensation, it's about history. It's about recognizing the grievous harm that was done to the content of Africa by the slave trade. When he asked me to write the foreword, what I didn't tell him was that his fufu had fallen into my soup. Because from 2023, I got an invitation to Nova Scotia. Why I was invited, I didn't really understand. But it was a conference of African universities studying reparations. And so in 2023, that's where my interest in the issue of reparations was ignited. And so he didn't know I was stepping on a stone when he came and said, "Can you write the foreword for my book on reparations?" Of course, I was gradually becoming a scholar myself on the issue of reparations, so I gladly accepted. And I had come back from that conference with loads and loads and loads of studies on reparations. So it made it very easy for me to just belt out that foreword for him. And when he came to pre-launch the book, we ordered some copies, and I very happily distributed it amongst my fellow presidents. What I have to admit to him is that because I couldn't find him in office absence when I distributed the book, they asked for an autograph, but the author wasn't there, and so they say I autographed it. So if you find a few copies of your book with my autograph on it, then I am seeking your permission to defend that. He referred to Sarah Batman, and he talked about a woman with significant backsides. I'm sure we all have sisters and wives. I can particularly testify. And because of the Caucasian physique was for flat bottoms. And so this was seen as extraordinary that a woman should be so endowed at the posterior. And so, like you said, she was taken to Europe. She was South African, and she was taken to Europe by two people who promised her a play along. And so they exhibited her in a cage, like an animal. And people will come and look at her. She would have to undress to show her posterior. And people will come and look at her and laugh and jeer and do everything. Eventually, that woman committed suicide. I mean, the humiliation, the degradation was too much to bear. He also gave the example of the woman from Elvina. Those days when they baptized you, they discarded your native name. So we don't have on the record what her actual native name was, but she was baptized in the castle. And once you were baptized in the castle, you were supposed to live a pure Christian life. She was bitten by a cat, and the injury was festering. And so, I mean, like all Africans would do, she went to a herbalist to see if she could get a cure for the cat bite. And somebody went and reported her that she had gone to a fetish priest. And so they accused her of witchcraft. And they had a court in the castle. So the trial started in Elvina Castle. And the appellate body was in Portugal. And so at a point, the judiciary in Elmina Castle decided to refer the case to the appellate body in Portugal. And so she was transported to Portugal to continue her trial. And so she was found guilty of witchcraft, but she was given a light sentence. And the sentence was Christian re-education. And so she had to undergo Christian re-education to cement her faith. And eventually she was discharged as being a reformed prisoner because she had imbibed the Christian ideology properly. But she wasn't brought back to Elmina. She was abandoned in Portugal until she died. So these are just individual examples, but they are living examples of the humiliation the African person faced in the period of the slave trade. Cabral has done a beautiful review of the book, and Kwesi also spoke, and all of them mentioned the Middle Passage. The slaves, when you go to the castle, we go there as a tourist experience to educate ourselves, but also to enjoy a day out. But we cannot imagine the unspeakable horror that our people had to go through those castles. And you see the door of no return. They show you this is the door of no return. Once you went through that arc, you were loaded onto a canoe. The ships were offshore, and they took you onto the ship. And for those of you who have studied history and the slave trade, you would see designs of how the slaves were packed. There were several floors, and so they could take you to any of the floors. They tied the men separately, the women separately, the younger teenagers, infants separately. And the shackles were on the floor, and so you had to lie down, and your hands were shackled, your legs were shackled, and so you could virtually not move. The passage from Africa to the Caribbean and the Americas typically took between 80 to 90 days. So imagine being shackled in a ship for 80 to 90 days, unable to move, unable to sit, just lying on your backside. They come with a little food, open your mouth and slap something into your mouth. You are forced to swallow in order that you can survive. And in many cases, illness broke out on the ships. And when people were too ill to continue the passage, in order not to spread whatever illness they were suffering from, they were thrown overboard in what was called the Middle Passage. Now, if you look at estimates of the trade, Kwesi stated about 12 million. But if you do the math, the average slave ships took between 400 and 600 slaves at a time. And it is estimated that there were about 36,000 slave voyages between 1514 and 1866. So if you look at 36,000 slave voyages with an average of 400 to 600, the estimate would be much higher than 12 million. And if you landed your slave vessel with 20 to 30% loss, that was acceptable. And so if 36,000 slave voyages with almost close to 20 million people were carried across, and there was a loss, acceptable loss of 20 to 30%, then you are looking at deaths of between 3 and 4 million people who didn't get to the destination. And the horror of the slave trade was felt on both sides of the Atlantic. Families that lost their parents, both mothers and fathers. And so a lot of children were orphaned because their fathers and mothers were enslaved and forcibly removed. And so, on the other side, relatives who were torn from their families forever and had to be auctioned, and there was a slave market. They tied you to a stake, and the white plantation owners would come and inspect, open your mouth, look at your teeth to see if any of your teeth are falling out, you know, raise your armpits and all that. I mean, just like you buy a sheep in the market, and eventually if he decided to buy you, he took you, and like they always do, in order to enslave you completely, they change your name. And so that's how you can become Cassius Clay, because your slave owner was called Clay, and he named you Cassius. And yet your African name might have been something completely different. For those of you who have watched Roots, you remember Kunta Kinte, when they tried to force him to change his name. So these are a few more details of the slave trade and the issue of reparations. And I think that Kwesi's book is a very important contribution to the struggle for reparations, not only, like he said, in terms of monetary compensation, but also in terms of making people remember that history. There is something in history we call revisionism. Revisionism is when a government adopts a particular policy to try to rewrite the history according to how they want people to remember it. And I'm sorry to say, we saw a bit of revisionism in Ghana, where the issue of the founder of Ghana and the role of different political movements, and a new curriculum was written, and somebody's name was removed and reduced to one sentence and things like that. That is also revisionism. But even in terms of the slave trade, there's revisionism going on in this country. And not in this country, in this world. I don't know how many of you have visited the Smithsonian in America. I have history. It starts from the early period of America, when it was only the Indians there, how they arrived there, how they settled, their way of life, and their beautiful exhibits. And then it moves from that period to when the migrants started coming from Ireland and other places, the Pilgrim Fathers and all of them, and settled on the West Coast. It also captures the early building of the railways. It captures the slave trade in detail and has exhibits on the slave trade. It captures how there was a push from the west to the east coast and how the Indians were dispossessed of their land. But it also has a lot of modern exhibits. The Apollo moon landing, the exhibits are there. The first computer that was built, you would learn about it. And so there's a lot to learn. And if you have been following the news, recently somebody said, the Smithsonian has too many negative stories. That is revisionism. And so if you go to the Smithsonian, you come out depressed. But that is your history. That is the truth. But of course, that is a way of attacking the Smithsonian and saying that, okay, take some of those adverts that are negative of America so that we can go through and see a happy story and we live happily ever after America, you know, and that is the intent of, you know, going at the Smithsonian. And it's not only the Smithsonian, you know, Black African Month and all that are all under attack by a new group who say they are tired of being politically correct. And so they must be left free to express their racist views. And so all these are happening. And so the reparations movement is being resisted. And like Kwesi said, we all saw the genocide. It was horrible. And I've watched documentaries on Auschwitz and how people were led like cattle into the gas chambers. And they were giving a different story that they were going, to be employed and paid and, to have a nice place to stay as prisoners. And yet, the people running the camp knew that you were packing them into a place to gas them and kill them. Women, children, men. That was horrible. But like it was said, it's documented that 6 million people were affected. The slave trade was almost twice that. And so, like Kwesi said, if you can restitute for that, why can we not demand restitution for what was the most criminal human enterprise known to history? And today, in the world, there's still genocide. We're seeing images that are reminiscent of what happened in the Second World War. We're seeing emaciated children. We're seeing people being starved slowly. We're seeing people being displaced. We're seeing people whose homeland is being converted to be turned into a Riviera. And we must have the courage to speak about these things. And so those were just a few comments I made. I have a speech here. I don't know if I should still read it. But I guess I should for the record. So here goes. This evening's gathering is both solemn and celebratory. Solemn because the subject matter, reparations, compels us to reckon with the unfinished business of history. Celebratory because we're here to honor the tireless scholarship and activism of Mr. Kwesi Pratt Jr., who has gifted us this colonialism and the structures of racial capitalism were not accidents of history. They were deliberate and coordinated systems of plunder supported by religious edicts enforced by colonial armies and legitimized by political institutions. Yet, as the author, Kwesi Pratt Jr., eloquently shows, passively endured. From Queen Nzinga to Yasantiwa, from the Mau Mau in Kenya to the Edo Kingdom, the Frantic Confederation, the Amazons in Benin, to our Pan-African visionaries like Nkrumah and Cabral, our ancestors resisted. They fought with courage, intellect, and faith, leaving us a legacy of agency and resilience. Reparations are not charity, they are moral, legal, and political obligation. As I said recently in Canada, the world found the resources to rebuild Europe after World War II, to compensate Israel after the Holocaust, and to reconstruct Japan after the Hiroshima bomb. Yet the greatest crime against humanity, the enslavement of millions of Africans and the pillage of a continent, has never been fully addressed. Reparations must therefore go beyond financial compensation. They must restore historical memory. They must affirm spiritual dignity and drive systemic reforms of the global order. They must inspire curriculum changes in our schools, structural reforms in global trade and finance, and a reimagining of international governance. I speak here not only as the President of the Republic of Ghana, but also as the AU champion for reparations. The AU has rightly declared reparations as the theme of the decade. And I must say it was the theme for this year, 2025, January to 31st December. But when we went to Addis the last time, the decade from 2025 to 2035 has been declared by the AU as a decade of reparations. This is a call to action. We cannot continue to accept global double standards. Africa must demand fairness, equity, and justice. We must push for transforming the UN and other international institutions to reflect the true equality among nations. Kwesi's book is a decisive contribution to this global struggle. As I said, it is not an easy book. It unsettles you, it challenges, it demands, but it's also a hopeful book. It affirms that the reparation struggle is both urgent and transformative. On behalf of the people of Ghana, I salute Mr. Pratt for his scholarship, his courage, and his lifelong dedication to the Pan-African cause. The struggle for reparations is not merely about the past, it is about the future. It's about building a just world where Africa and her diaspora stand tall, not as victims of history, but architects of a new and equitable order. As we launch this vital work today, let us all recommit ourselves to this cause. Let us mobilize our youth, our women, our intellectuals and diaspora communities, and let us carry forward Nkrumah's vision and our forebears' sacrifice. Reparations are not a dream deferred, they are a demand whose time has come. And I thank you all for being part of this historic moment. May God bless Africa, may God bless Ghana, and I have the privilege to launch the book, Reparations, History, Struggle, Politics, and Law. Author, Kwesi Pratt, Jr. Right, today no fireworks, they have some. You know, when presidents go anywhere and they make a pledge or they promise something to happen here or do this here, you know who pays it? The Chief of Staff. So my comrade is launching his book. I can afford to be generous because the Chief of Staff will pay. So I'll buy the first copy for 200,000.
And Your Excellency, just before you go, sir, does your appointees, presidential staffers, ministers, do they have your permission to pledge and buy? Not close to 200,000, but 100,000.
They are not as rich as other ministers, unfortunately.
They say having like this, but Miss Watienchi is also here. Okay. Education Minister, you are buying for the students, pardon? The president is here. Advocacy. Can we see all the president? 8 more copies, please. The president says you have his permission. So shall we have music in the background, please?
Go back.
Yes.
Tell it.
We haven't closed yet. We're only seeing of His Excellency. Thank you so much, Your Excellency, for being a part of the program. We are indeed grateful. Please, you can resume your seats. Then we can wrap up.